The folded piece of paper trembled in Michael Sterling's hand as he sat frozen in the corner booth of Rosewood Diner, his untouched $28 steak growing cold on the plate before him, and for the first time in 15 years. The self-made millionaire felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. 3 weeks ago, Michael had walked away from his penthouse, his luxury cars, and his executive lifestyle, checking into a modest motel on the edge of this small town with one mission: to find out if anyone in the world could see past wealth and status to the broken man underneath. Because after his daughter stopped speaking to him and his wife's funeral passed with only paid attendance, he realized he'd built an empire but lost his humanity. Dressed in a simple gray sweater and worn jeans, silver-flecked hair slightly disheveled, Michael had spent 19 days visiting local establishments, watching how people treated a man who appeared ordinary, unremarkable. In Visibland, the loneliness of anonymity had been both painful and oddly liberating. Rosewood Diner had become his regular spot for the past week, a vintage establishment with red leather booths, chrome-trimmed counters, and black and white checkered floors that reminded him of the small restaurant his grandmother had worked in when he was a boy, before ambition had pulled him away from everyone who ever truly loved him. The waitress, Sarah Mitchell, couldn't have been more than 28, with kind hazel eyes and light brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her white blouse and black apron spotless despite the dinner rush, and unlike the polished executives who had surrounded Michael for decades. There was something genuine in her tired smile that made him feel seen rather than served. On his first visit, he'd watched her slip an extra biscuit to an elderly man who counted coins for his coffee. On the third day, she'd patiently explained the menu to a confused child while his frazzled mother handled a crying baby. And yesterday Michael had observed her give her own dinner to a homeless woman who'd wandered in from the cold, telling the manager she'd simply changed her mind about eating. Tonight, Michael had ordered the most expensive item on the modest menu, a ribeye steak with garlic butter, partly to see if it would change Sarah's demeanor toward him, partly because he'd decided this would be his last test before returning to his empty life with the confirmation that authentic human connection was indeed extinct. Sarah had taken his order with the same warm efficiency she showed everyone, asking how he wanted it cooked, if he needed fresh coffee, whether he'd like to try the homemade apple pie that had just come out of the oven, treating him with neither special attention nor dismissal, just simple dignity. When she'd brought his plate, Michael had noticed the exhaustion in her eyes, the slight limp he'd seen develop over the week, the way her smile faltered for just a moment when she thought no one was watching, and he'd wondered what burdens this young woman carried while still managing to radiate such consistent kindness. He'd cut into his steak, prepared to eat mechanically while observing the other diners, when Sarah had returned to refill his water glass and discreetly slipped a folded napkin beside his plate, her eyes meeting his briefly with an expression he couldn't quite read: concern, perhaps, or recognition, before she moved on to the next table without a word. Michael's heart had begun pounding as he set down his fork, his hand suddenly unsteady as he reached for the napkin, unfolding it beneath the table like a schoolboy with a secret note, and the handwritten words in simple blue ink had stopped his breath entirely. "I know who you are, Mr. Sterling, and I know you've been watching us." "Watching me? Just wanted you to know that your money doesn't matter here. But you do, and if you're lost, like you seem to be, maybe you should stop testing strangers and start calling your daughter, because life's too short to spend it alone, even in a crowded room." Someone who learned that lesson the hard way. Michael's vision blurred as tears he hadn't allowed himself to cry in years suddenly burned behind his eyes, his throat constricting with emotion so powerful it bordered on physical pain. Because this waitress, this young woman he'd been silently judging, testing, observing like a specimen, had seen through everything, had recognized him despite his disguise, and instead of treating him differently or asking for anything, she'd offered him the one thing his billions couldn't buy: honest, compassionate truth. He looked up, searching the diner for Sarah, finding her at the counter rolling silverware and napkins, her profile backlit by the warm glow of the vintage fixtures, and the casual grace with which she worked even in pain, even exhausted, reminded him suddenly, powerfully, of his late wife Maria in the early years, before success had made him unavailable, before he'd traded presence for presence, connection for capital. Sarah glanced over, caught his eye, and offered a small, knowing smile that held no judgment, only kindness. And Michael felt something in his chest crack open, not break, but open, like a door long locked, finally admitting light. He stood abruptly, his legs unsteady, and walked toward the counter, where Sarah continued her work, her expression calm and patient as she waited for him to find his words. And when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "How did you know?" Sarah's smile softened, her eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed far older than her years, and she gestured to a framed photograph on the wall near the kitchen. A faded picture of a ribbon-cutting ceremony from 20 years ago, showing a much younger Michael Sterling donating funds to save this very diner from closure, standing beside a beaming woman who must have been the original owner. "Mrs. Rosewood kept that picture until she died last year and left me this place," Sarah said quietly, setting down her silverware. "She used to tell me about the young businessman who saved her restaurant when the banks wouldn't, who didn't want publicity or payback, just asked her to keep serving good food to good people. She said you had kind eyes back then, and when you came in last week, I saw those same eyes, just sadder, more lost." Michael's hand went to his chest as if to physically hold together the pieces of himself that were coming apart. Memories flooding back of Maria's pride when he'd helped Mrs. Rosewood, of how she'd kissed his cheek and called him her hero for using his success to lift others, of the man he'd been before ambition became obsession, before he'd forgotten why he'd wanted success in the first place. "I've been testing you," he admitted, shame coloring his voice, "testing everyone, trying to find proof that kindness was dead, that I hadn't missed anything important by choosing money over people, over my daughter, over my wife in her final years. I think I wanted permission to stop feeling guilty for my choices." Sarah's expression filled with compassionate understanding rather than the anger he deserved, and she reached across the counter to briefly touch his hand. A gesture so simple, yet so profound, it nearly undid him completely. "My mom died 3 years ago, while I was working 60-hour weeks, trying to build a career in the city, chasing success I thought would make her proud, and I didn't make it home in time to say goodbye. Inherited this diner, moved to this town, started over, because I learned that the life you live in pursuit of someday costs you all your todays. And you can't get those back, Mr. Sterling, no matter how much money you have." The diner sounds faded into background noise as Michael stood in the transformative power of absolute truth. This young woman's hard-earned wisdom cutting through 15 years of self-deception, justification, and emotional isolation. And he thought of his daughter Emma, 26 now, an artist living in Seattle, whose calls he'd ignored, whose gallery openings he'd missed, whose wedding invitation he'd declined because of a merger meeting, whose tear-stained letter, after her mother's funeral, had accused him of loving his empire more than his family. "She won't forgive me," Michael whispered, voicing his deepest fear. The one that had driven him to this strange undercover mission. This test of humanity that had really been a test of whether he deserved forgiveness himself. "I missed everything that mattered: her graduation, her first exhibition, her mother's last birthday, the funeral. How do you come back from that?" Sarah's eyes glistened with empathy, and she glanced at the clock on the wall before untying her apron with decisive movements. "My shift ends in 5 minutes, and you're going to sit right there while I make you the apple pie I promised, and then you're going to tell me about your daughter, not because you're paying me, but because I think you need to remember her out loud before you can face her in person." 40 minutes later, Michael found himself in that same corner booth with Sarah sitting across from him, 2 plates of apple pie between them. His wallet still in his pocket, his defenses completely down, and for the first time in years, he talked about him really talked, sharing stories of her childhood curiosity, her artistic talent that had emerged at age 4. The way she'd waited up for him on so many nights he never came home. The understanding in Maria's eyes, as illness had taken her and she'd whispered, "There's still time with Emma. Don't waste it like you wasted our last years." Sarah listened with complete presence, occasionally asking questions, sharing parallel stories from her own life, and the conversation flowed with the easy authenticity of 2 people who'd both learned painful lessons about priority and presence, about the difference between success and significance. "What if I call and she doesn't answer?" Michael asked, vulnerability written across his features. This powerful man reduced to the frightened father he'd been hiding beneath layers of corporate armor. "What if I've waited too long, tested her patience, one too many times?" Sarah reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her phone, sliding it across the table with a gentle but firm expression. "Then you call again, and you keep calling, and you show up, and you prove through consistency what you failed to prove through presence. You become the father she needed. Starting right now, not someday, not after one more deal, not when you feel worthy, but now, tonight, this moment." Michael stared at the phone as if it were both lifeline and judge, his hand shaking as he picked it up. And Sarah recited his daughter's number from memory, the same number he had stored in his own phone, but had been too afraid, too proud, too ashamed to dial. The line rang once, twice, 3 times, and Michael's breath caught in his throat. Years of regret and hope compressed into these infinite seconds, and then a cautious voice answered, "Hello?" And his daughter's voice, Semma's voice, shattered every remaining wall he'd built around his heart. "Emma, it's Dad," Michael managed, his voice breaking on the words, tears now flowing freely down his face, while Sarah quietly stood and moved away to give him privacy, though her encouraging smile remained visible from across the diner. "I know I have no right to call, no right to ask for your time, after I wasted so much of it. But I'm sitting in a diner in a small town, and a wise young woman just taught me that someday is a thief, and today is a gift, and I don't want to waste another single today. Without you, in it I can't undo the past, Emma. But I'm asking if you'll let me try to build a different future." The silence on the other end lasted an eternity and a heartbeat. And then Emma's voice came through, thick with emotion, cautious but not closed. "Where have you been, Dad? Not just physically, but where have you been?" And in that question Michael heard not just accusation, but invitation. A daughter's desperate hope that her father might finally be present, might finally choose her over everything else that had always seemed more important. For the next 2 hours, Michael sat in that booth and had the most honest conversation of his life, confessing his failures, listening to Emma's pain, accepting her anger, sharing his own brokenness, and slowly, carefully, beginning to build the first fragile bridge across the chasm his choices had created. And when Emma finally said, "I'm showing my work in a small gallery here next Friday at 7 if you come, really come and stay for the whole thing. Maybe we can have dinner after and keep talking." Michael felt hope flicker to life in the darkness he'd been living in. When the call ended, Sarah reappeared with fresh coffee and the knowing look of someone who understood that transformation rarely happened in boardrooms or through grand gestures, but in small diners over cold steak and honest conversations, in the courage to be seen in your brokenness, in the grace of strangers who become unexpected guides. "I'm going to Seattle on Friday," Michael said, his voice stronger now, purpose replacing the aimless desperation he'd carried for weeks. "I'm going to show up for my daughter, and then I'm going to keep showing up, for as long as it takes to prove that I've finally learned what matters." Sarah nodded, her tired face radiant with genuine joy for this broken man who'd found his way back to himself. Mrs. Rosewood used to say that the same success that can trap you can also free you, if you use it right to have resources, Mr. Sterling, but more importantly, you have today, and if you use your todays well, you might find that the life you thought you'd lost was just waiting for you to come back to it. Michael reached for his wallet, but Sarah waved him off with mock sternness. The pie is on the house, and your steak got cold because of my note, so consider us even, but if you want to do something for me, send me a picture from your daughter's gallery opening, because I'd like to know how this story ends. As Michael stood to leave, he paused, looking at this remarkable young woman who'd seen past his disguise, called out his hiding, and offered him redemption without asking for anything in return. And he made a decision that felt like the first truly right choice he'd made in years. Sarah, I bought this building 20 years ago and arranged for Mrs. Rosewood to manage it. I'd forgotten about it, honestly. It was such a small part of my portfolio, but I'm going to have my lawyers draw up papers transferring full ownership to you. No strings, no conditions, because you're doing exactly what I hoped someone would do here, serving good food to good people, and seeing the humanity in everyone who walks through that door, including lost millionaires who forgot who they were. Sarah's eyes widened, her hand going to her mouth, and for a moment, the composure she'd maintained throughout cracked, to reveal the struggling young woman beneath. The one who'd been worried about next month's lease, about repairs she couldn't afford, about keeping her inherited dream alive on hope and determination. I can't accept, she began, but Michael gently interrupted, his voice firm with the authority that had built his empire, now finally directed toward something meaningful. You already accepted the harder gift you gave me, truth, when I needed it more than anything money could buy. You saw me when I'd made myself invisible. You cared when you had every reason to be indifferent. This is just paperwork, Sarah, but what you gave me tonight was my life back, and there's no price tag that could match that value. 6 months later, Michael Sterling stood in a Seattle art gallery, his arm around his daughter Emma as she beamed beside her sold-out exhibition, her wife Jennifer on her other side, and the three of them looked at paintings that told stories of loss and reconciliation, absence and return, broken things made beautiful through acceptance and love. And Michael knew that every image on these walls was partly about him, about them, about the journey from abandonment to presence, and he'd never been more proud or more grateful for a second chance he'd barely deserved, but had been given anyway. In his pocket, he carried a photo that Sarah had sent him last week, the newly renovated Rosewood diner with a small plaque by the door reading a place where everyone matters. And beside it, Sarah stood with her small staff, her face free of the exhaustion he'd seen that first night, replaced with the peace that comes from purpose and security, from dreams sustained rather than deferred. And he'd framed a copy for his new apartment, smaller than his penthouse, closer to Emma, filled with photos and meaning rather than marble and emptiness, as Emma introduced him to her artist friends, calling him my dad with a warmth that had taken months of consistent showing up to rebuild. Michael thought about that folded napkin that had stopped him cold in a corner booth, about the waitress who'd cared enough to speak truth to a stranger, about the moment when his carefully constructed test of humanity had reversed itself, revealing that he was the one being tested, being measured, being found wanting but not worthless, broken but not beyond repair. The note still lived in his wallet, carried everywhere, as a reminder that transformation rarely announces itself with fanfare, that it often arrives as a simple gesture from an unexpected source, that the walls we build to protect ourselves become the prisons we must escape, and that sometimes the bravest thing a powerful man can do is accept help from someone with nothing to give but honesty, compassion, and the hard-earned wisdom that today matters more than someday. That presence is the only present that truly counts, and that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be before success, fear, or pride convinced you to become someone else instead. When Emma hugged him goodnight, whispering, "I'm glad you came back, Dad. I'm glad you kept coming back," Michael Sterling closed his eyes and felt the truth of his transformation settle into his bones. He'd gone undercover to test if kindness still existed in the world, and a waitress, with tired eyes and a generous heart, had slipped him a note that didn't just stop him cold. It melted the ice he'd been living in, called him back to life, back to love, back to the understanding that the wealth that matters can't be counted in bank accounts, but in moments like this, in relationships restored, in the sacred ordinary miracle of being truly, finally, gratefully present for the people who make life worth living.